What do I even say to start a podcast about video games? Likely, whoever you are, welcome by the way, you came to this video with a developed opinion on the topic of video games. There are, of course, many different and quite diametrically opposed opinions on them, and I find that over the course of my near 40 years on this earth, I've held many of them. For some strange reason, there seems to be a lot of overlap between artists and video games, thus the topic of today's podcast. Now, as you might have noted from the title of the video, I obviously don't think they are an evil, at least not always. I had the fortunate childhood experience of growing up with a father who actually took my mother to the arcades for a date at one point. As you might assume, this means I grew up with video games, starting primarily with the original Nintendo and early PC games. Greetings, by the way, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Zach. I'm an artist and an art teacher who spent 11 years teaching middle school and high school art. This is going to be a little bit different podcast than we normally do here on the channel, but even if you don't participate in playing video games, I would encourage you to listen anyway. There is a lot of overlap in the benefits they provide that stretch into other forms of interactive media, such as board games, fiction novels, and even some shows and movies. So let's dive in and look at some profound benefits of video games for the artist. Before we get started, let's clear something up. Of course, if you spend all of your time playing video games and very little time working on your art, is it really the game's fault that you are not progressing? People become addicted to video games in the same way that they do with many other actions and substances. If you find that you struggle with these kinds of things, particularly as it concerns video games, then don't use art as an excuse to play them. Do what makes the most sense for you and take care of yourself. Instead, I am functioning under the assumption that all humans need some downtime, some break time from the rigors of work, study, and daily life. And if you as an artist are putting that time into something, that reasonable quantity of time, video games can actually be quite a good outlet for you. So let's move into the first thing: problem solving. On a very fundamental level, video games have a leg up on other forms of entertainment. They allow you to interact with something. If the video game does not change or benefit from your interaction with it, it's really just a video, not a game. Problem solving in this fashion, psychologically similar perhaps to chess, Sudoku, or crossword puzzles, is good for the brain, and in particular, good for the brain of an artist. So much of what we do when we draw or paint is concerned with problem solving, asking difficult questions and then working through the best or most beautiful way to answer that question. I've been studying rocks and stones lately with the members of our Discord community. There's a link for it below, by the way, in case you want to check it out. When I sit down to study an artistic element, I often search for what makes it, well, it. What makes a rock a rock? What makes a tree a tree? Artistically, there are certain qualities, things in shape language or texture, that tell our unconscious mind what a two-dimensional representation of a thing is actually portraying. These unique questions have to be answered, and it is a struggle to do so. It's not a quick thing, and often you cannot research the answer, you have to simply struggle with it. Trees are made up of many parts. Their branches rotate in a spiral fashion around the trunk, always getting thinner as you move towards the zenith. Rocks often have a great tonal shift as you move from highlight to shadow, yet some are polished and smooth and follow a totally different set of rules. These things are true for most of what we uncover when we work on things artistically. These are almost a platonic ideal in a way. We're looking for the trueness of a thing. Why does a tree look like a tree when we draw it or when we look at it in real life? And then what are the discrepancies between how we represent that normally versus how we really want to represent that? For example, if you look at a particular tree and you try to draw it, it's probably not going to look like the tree that exists in your mind, your schema, like the saved image file that your brain has for a tree. That's because our brain has created that image based on the summation of thousands, if not tens of thousands of different trees. It's concocted these little save points, these idealized components. Sometimes those translate really well into our drawings, and sometimes they don't. For me, recently, it's been the realization that trees are generally made up of, this is deciduous trees, by the way, are generally made up of a series of overlapping spherical shapes. That's the way that the canopy is kind of put together. And when I think about it that way, I can think about shading each of those as they move into one another. If you don't do something like this, have a set of rules that you're following in your mind, things that you're thinking about for how a thing is constructed, you tend to construct it in a two-dimensional way. Now, for the tree again, this would look like you have an understanding of how to represent the tree from one angle, but you're really thinking about the trunk, the branches, and the foliage on top as singular elements. And that just doesn't contribute to having a very full understanding of the thing that you're trying to construct. When you do that, you generally have the branches both going out the left and the right side, but there's no branches coming towards you. There's no branches going away from you. And obviously that's not how trees function. So there is some basic problem solving that has to happen when you're trying to translate something from the real world onto a flat surface. Now, if you're sculpting, this becomes totally different because in a lot of ways you're just replicating what exists in the real world. But there's probably a lot fewer sculptors listening to this than there are 2D artists. But if you are one of my sculptors who is listening to this, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. So how do video games help with this? How do they aid us? They often promote the very same things, a slow, arduous problem solving. And if you play games with difficult bosses, you also get to practice the age-old skill of slamming your head against a brick wall until you're successful. When I think about problem solving, my brain immediately jumps to the puzzles of the old Zelda games. I didn't grow up with The Legend of Zelda, though it was certainly around in my youth. My first game in the series was Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64. What a fantastic game. I know they've done a revamped version of it recently, but I haven't touched it because I'm one of those weirdos that wants the thing to exist in my brain as what it originally was, and I don't want to go on to the new one. I spent the better part of a semester of 8th grade working through those dungeons, trying to find that elusive heart piece and working fast enough to finally score the big Goron sword. But the puzzles were tough, especially in a mostly pre-internet world where you couldn't look things up easily. In fact, back in the day, we would look things up in guides that either Prima or Nintendo Power would produce themselves. But the funny part is, because those were produced and then distributed, mistakes existed in them. So sometimes you would be reading the actual official guidebook from the company that produced a game, and it would have incorrect information. But the ability to look things up just didn't really exist. So what we would do is we would call friends. Yes, we would use the phone and call friends, because texting also didn't exist. And we would try to figure out, like, how did you solve this, man? I can't figure out this water temple. It's so difficult, and I keep drowning, or I forget to get the boots on, or whatever it might be. So we had to call each other and work through these issues. And it was hard, but it was also really, really fun. That kind of tenacious problem solving built in me and in many others an ability to find joy and fun in the solving of those issues. And that translates directly, if you allow it, over to artistic things. It is hard to draw a rock and make it actually look like a rock, especially if you're creating it from your mind and you're not just trying to work from a reference. But if you can learn through video games the joy that comes from spending a lot of time, often not very fun time, working to solve a thing, and then finding that satisfaction in the actual solution, that translates over directly to working on things artistically. Video games can be a great way to use your downtime to continue to hone your problem-solving skills, and even in some cases to build your resilience. Another thing that video games can do for us as artists is they can provide some form of community. I've talked about this several times recently, the need for artists to have a good and supportive artistic community. It's a really important thing. It's part of the reason that we have the Discord community going on right now, because myself included, artists need community. We need people to bounce ideas off of. We need people to run things by, and we need some support sometimes. There are unique difficulties that artists seem to encounter in our lives, difficulties that are substantially mediated by a solid community. Things tend to build up in our heads, and for better or worse, we tend to not have a very clear image of our artwork or our ideas without some other third parties to kind of throw some things in there. We have a tendency to be introverted, and we have a tendency to have fairly niche interests, to focus for long periods of time on the same potentially esoteric thing. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Do you fit into this boat? So it should come as no surprise that anything that might provide a fairly positive community might be beneficial for us as artists. This is where video games can be a wonderful advantage. I'd like to break this part down into two categories: playing games with friends actively, and having a common interest to discuss and dissect with fellow artists. When I was young, again, before playing online was accessible for most people or games, we had to spend time at each other's houses to play games. We spent so much time in middle and high school playing Halo, Perfect Dark, 007, Mario Kart, and of course, Smash Brothers. We played for hours, we made up funny nicknames, created strange inside jokes, and took part in all manner of shenanigans, most of which were safe. In short, it was a lovely social part of our youth. I'm not going to lie here and say that we then put down the controllers and dove into our art with reckless abandon. That would be dishonest, and, we did spend a lot of time playing video games. But those video game sessions gave us community. They gave us time with friends. They gave us people that we belonged with. And that was reinforcement during the long periods of time spent in the dark basement working on art projects. It was less that the video games were an essential part of the process and more that they provided community, that essential thing for just being a human. It can be so hard as artists sometimes when we spend so much time by ourselves working on things with our esoteric interests and our hobbies that really can't be done with a whole bunch of other people. It's easy to become really isolated if you put lots and lots of time into your art, because art is by its nature kind of isolating. And so having something like this, video game community, it provides that human thing that we all need. The need to belong, the need to be a part of something, the need to have somebody to talk to when you've had a bad day. And the video games provided that for a lot of us. Now, there were also many times where I would sit and watch my friends play single-player games, and, I would just sit in the background and work on things for my sketchbook. It was good for my soul to be around my friends. I would ask questions. Sometimes I would start drawing what they were doing on the screen, but most of the time, it was just that community. This does take a little bit of a different form nowadays, though, being that most of us play games online, but I find that at least a large percentage of it holds true. If you play online with any community or even have friends focused on the same games as you have things to talk about, which actually leads us to the next area. The ability to have that common interest that you discuss and dissect with others. This is one of the most wonderful areas that is prolific today, with whole careers and YouTube channels dedicated to single game series. If you had told me growing up that there would be people who made their living simply talking about Zelda, I would have been baffled. I grew up without YouTube, it simply didn't exist when I was a kid. It's still kind of mind-blowing, honestly, that this exists. Diving into common interests builds community, though. Friendships can often blossom when you run into people with a deep, abiding love for the same games that you have. The pulling apart of ideas and concepts, the continual searching for lore, there is camaraderie in that, and we desperately need community. We as artists, for better or worse, are human, and we have those same human needs. The oddity here is the fact that our hobbies often sequester us, and they remove us from community naturally. There are many people and many different kinds of hobbies that will actually build community by their nature, but most of those hobbies don't involve spending 20 hours a week staring at a screen, drawing slowly and slowly putting things together. So we have maybe more of a need for community than a lot of other hobby groups do. The next thing that I want to talk about is storytelling. Obviously, it's an integrated component of games basically from stem to stern. Storytelling is often the element that attracts us and binds us to a game, and it just so happens that it is also one of the most attractive aspects of art for many people. So seeing wonderful examples of storytelling in action is an obvious boon for the artist. The stories that I try to tell with my work, the stories that I try to write, are always going to be influenced by the games that I have played. In the same way my art is influenced by the books I've read and the things that I have experienced in my life. That's simply how art works, regardless of what form of art we're talking about. But my art and storytelling were far less complex when I was younger. Some of this came from the fact that my life was more simple, I was less experienced, and for better or worse, I had experienced less tragedy. Those things in adulthood have affected my work, and they make it more nuanced, more human. Likewise, the time that I have invested in the Metroid game series and in Elden Ring have massively influenced my art over the last few years. That dark, ominous atmosphere with this little tiny ray of hope shining out. I find it extremely appealing, and those games have it in spades. When I hit Inktober in 2023, I started working through the ideas as I had for maybe 3 or 4 years prior. The first image that I worked on was just this cute little teddy bear monster dreaming of meat. But right after that, I started accidentally at first telling this story about this little sorceress girl exploring things. And as her journeys went on, I found that they took on this kind of dark, eldritch, Lovecraftian quality. It was this single female character, a child, exploring things that were both terrifying and magnificent, and she was going through all these underground caverns. There are aspects of the Metroid game series that come out in that. There are elements of playing through Metroid Dread that it was so scary. I died more times in that video game than I can remember, and my heart rate just sits at this much elevated level because it's a stressful game to play. Elden Ring has had many of those same emotional responses from me. It was my first Souls-like game. It was terrifying and scary. But in both of those series, there's always this little ray of hope. Like, your character is always working towards some good, working toward doing something good. In the Metroid games, there's basically no dialogue in any of the older ones, and you don't run into anything that is ever your friend, except every once in a while you run into these little creatures, never sentient things. They're always little like animals and this weird bird that teaches you how to jump, do the shine spark in Super Metroid. They're these cute little creatures, but they are like the only thing that is friendly to you. And in the Dark Souls games, it seems very much the same, that you very, very seldom run into something that is your friend, something that is going to help you and is not going to betray you at some point down the line. Those aspects came into my Inktober drawings, and I found myself like slowly stitching things together. I worked on, the second drawing and it had the character. I worked on the third drawing, it had the character. By the fourth or fifth, and everyone after, it was the same character and the same story. Where's she going next? How can I, figure out how to work in this prompt in a way that creates an interesting narrative structure for this character to explore? That happened because I played those games. Now, would the drawings have been better or worse if I hadn't played those games? I don't know. But the storytelling elements of those drawings made me stick with them, made me get excited about them, gave me a sense of direction for where they were going, and I think made them more interesting for people who were viewing those pieces of art. I really think that good storytelling is just intrinsically linked to what we're trying to do in our artwork. And it might seem like this only really applies, or at least applies more to things like comics or work with characters, but that's really fundamentally not true. Most good artwork of any kind tells some semblance of a story. Most of the most famous paintings and drawings for all of human history tell some kind of story. Part of the reason that the Mona Lisa was so intriguing is that it's this fairly unknown woman who has a very curious look on her face. Some of the paintings done by the Dutch painter Vermeer, they're just curious. They give us like just enough to wonder who this person is, what's being displayed here, what's going on. If you think about Diego Velasquez, he did this gigantic painting called Las Meninas, which I believe is the Maidens. It's this massive painting that has reflection in it. The artist himself is in it. The little princess is getting dressed. It looks like her parents are in the back, but maybe it's a painting, maybe it's a mirror. It's really hard to know what's going on. There's a story there. It's intriguing, way more intriguing than if it had just been a simple portrait. The best pieces of art for our entire shared history always have an element of storytelling in them. And if you are trying to up the level of skill, the level of interest, the appeal of your artwork, just giving into storytelling is always going to be one of those things that's going to make it just a little bit better. Think about it, even if you're working on a still life, the things that are in that still life are going to be way more intriguing if there's just something that's a little bit off, something that tells a story about who might have owned these objects, why they were set up this way. Google some of these still lifes from the Renaissance or the Baroque era. You'll find all kinds of representations of food. The watermelons look bizarre because we hadn't bred them into what they are today. But there's lots of skulls and things, and sometimes candles and weird old tomes and books. they all tell a story. Just setting up a couple flowers and painting it might be beautiful, but if you have those flowers and they're coming out of an open human skull, it's going to be a lot more intriguing. Might be a little macabre, but it's going to be interesting. And it's going to keep your viewers' interest and probably keep your own interest as you move through the piece as well. So storytelling might not be the absolute most fundamental component of making your art better by improving your art, but it is certainly going to be one of the most integral components once you get past the basics. Emotional displays is our next benefit. What do I mean here? Many good video games, like other media, elicit an emotional response. They make us feel things. This, of course, is often a huge goal in our artwork. There is a ton we can learn, can derive from thinking through how and why things function the way they do in video games. Try to go back in your mind to the last time you played a video game or watched a movie and a particular element of the story just grabbed your heartstrings. Maybe it immediately destroyed you, or maybe it helped you see the beauty of the universe. Break that moment down. Think about it. Try it and analyze what happened there and why did it grab you. In that moment, there is much you can learn, much we can learn, that you can then implement into your own artworks, especially if you are trying to tell a story with your work. Video games do this in a wonderful way because you have more of a chance to embody the character, more of a chance to actually carry out the actions. In video games, though I know the characters are simply programmed, I am extremely hesitant to do anything bad or evil, anything that I wouldn't do in reality. There are no real-world consequences to being a bad person in a video game, but I have to make the decisions as an individual, and I'm so hesitant to do anything that is bad. I feel so much empathy for what are effectively just a series of zeros and ones creating pixels on a screen for me to look at. When a character really grabs you, when a cutscene lands beautifully, there are elements there that can be taken, borrowed, and applied to your artwork. Almost always because they're bringing to the forefront some manner of emotional response. So see what you can pull from video games and movies. Think about the emotions that particular situations make you feel and concoct a way to get your audience to feel that too. Now, the final area that I want to talk about as being the biggest benefit that video games can give us as artists is perhaps the most obvious. It's inspiration from visual design. When we play games, new data, new information, new ways of showing things off are being flooded into our mind. When I first stepped into Elden Ring, when I made that first step out of the catacomb that you kind of start the game in and came into Limgrave, I was seeing something for the first time. And every video game we played does this. Whether you're playing something like Kirby or Pac-Man that's kind of this weird, almost post-apocalyptic punk. It's beautifully colored, but kind of somber in its tone. Even a game like that has this visual reality that you are instantly immersed in. Every video game you play, especially if they're good video games, are naturally going to expose you to designs of things and how things could be visually represented. If you played any of the recent God of War games, there's a good chance that you as an artist like drawing characters. You like drawing those kind of sprawling vistas and landscapes. Maybe you like drawing weapons like I do. I love drawing swords and axes and spears and stuff like that. Those games are naturally going to expose you to the visual designs of the things that you want to work on. And if you take that inspiration out of the game, you don't just play it, you actually take the information and run with it, your artwork will be positively affected. I've talked about it before on this channel, but most of my early art was copying from video game booklets. Back in the day, they didn't have a lot of promotional material that was exposed to everyone all across the world because the internet basically didn't exist. So we would get a new video game, like I got Donkey Kong for the Super Nintendo, and in that booklet that came with the video game, there would be a whole bunch of art. It would introduce you to the story, it would introduce you to the characters, and I would just sit there with those booklets. Those little, slick magazine-style printed pages with the staples keeping them together, and I would fold those things back until the staples started to break and the paper started to fall apart. I would draw everything I could from those because they were just so intriguing. I would draw Donkey Kong and King K. Rool and the Claptraps and all these little guys. I had the one for Metroid. I remember drawing the Zebesians, the space pirates from Super Metroid, which would have been early 90s, if not late 80s. I guess it would be early 90s, just given the timetable on things. But I got a lot of my inspiration at the beginning of my art journey from video games. I played Command and Conquer and Total Annihilation, Warcraft 1 and Warcraft 2. Those games and their booklets gave me much of the inspiration that formed what I found interesting. I played those games before I ever started reading Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. I was interested probably in sci-fi and fantasy novels because of the video games that I had played. And much of what I have enjoyed working on, the stories that I write now, the things that I want to draw, even this awkward unicorn that's taking place behind us, those things come from the video games that I spent time with. There is so much to be said for the inspiration that you can get from playing through video games. Now, of course, you have to be careful. It's really easy to think that you're getting inspiration, to trick yourself into thinking that you're getting that, and you're really just playing video games a lot, and you're wasting a lot of time. You have to be honest with yourself, and I try to do this in my own life. I generally don't play any video games until after the rest of my family has gone to sleep at night. Not always, and now that I'm working on writing a novel, I don't even usually allow myself to play anything until after I've gotten my 1,000 words for the day written, which means a lot of times I don't get to come downstairs and play any video games until about 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. And I try to go to bed by about 10:30 or 11, so you could see how this would complicate things. But I also function under the assumption that video games are just like any other form of entertainment that people use. Playing video games is no different than going and watching basketball or football or a random Netflix show. It's something that we as humans can use to detox from our day. And if that's what you're using it for, that's fine. That's great. But if you can also make sure that the games that you are playing are going to add something to your life beyond just the entertainment, beyond just the relaxation, then you're going to find yourself in a much better, more holistic place. So I would encourage you to try to make sure that you have that balance, that you're avoiding the temptations and the deficits that can come here by playing too many video games, by playing video games that are just like eating a bag of Doritos. They're not good for you. They're not nourishing for your artistic mind. Is there a place for that? Yeah, of course. But, if you can play a game, if you're going to choose between two games and one of them is visually nourishing and it's going to inspire you and the other is just nothingness and entertainment, I think we both know which is probably the better decision to make. Maybe you have time for both. Maybe you do. I don't. I only really have the mental capacity to process a single game at a time. And right now, for the last 6 months, I've just been bouncing back and forth between Monster Hunter Iceborne and Elden Ring. And I've got a couple other games. I'm supposed to play the new Dragon's Dogma game, but I haven't gotten that one unwrapped or ready to go yet. But hopefully I will soon, and I'm sure that there'll be some inspiration in there. It's a nice kind of fantasy setting. I'm excited for it. But yeah, just try to avoid the temptations that come along with playing video games and tricking yourself into thinking that they are truly just inspiration when they can also become an addiction. They can also be something that just kind of sinks its fingers into you and keeps you from actually working through the productive components of your artistic journey. So here's a little tip just at the end of our podcast. I will often sit down to play video games at the end of a difficult day, and I will give myself a timer for 20 or 30 minutes. That seems like a pretty reasonable amount of time to sit down and play something. And then when that timer goes off, I will just hit whatever the next save point is, wherever I am. If I'm in combat of some kind, I'll finish that thing out, and that's when I'm done. If I'm lucky, sometimes that 30 minutes becomes 37 because I had to finish with something, but I try to stay pretty true to it, pretty honest. I feel like I get that little relieving of the pressure of the day, and at the same time, I get the fun and the joy that comes with getting out of things for a few minutes. Video games, for me, have always been an integral part of my life, really since I was probably 4 or 5 years old. They've been a wonderful source of inspiration, an exciting thing that I get to spend time with, and my artwork, my books that I'm writing, the stories that I tell, even the music that I write are all influenced by my time with video games. I know there is a modern trend to think that video games are this terrible, evil thing. And I suppose that, anything in the hands of humans can be evil, can turn into a bad thing. But I would rail very, very hard against the idea that video games, by their nature, are a bad thing. Can they be overdone? Yes, but most things can be. So, when you are sitting down to kind of just deal with the fact that you had a long day at work and you're getting prepped for going in and working on your drawing or your painting, spending some time in your sketchbook, and you just need a few minutes to detox, consider playing some video games that will be good for your artistic soul. Things that will give you an opportunity to explore new worlds, to see new things, to experience beautiful storytelling and wonderful emotional highs and lows. Search for those things. They are there, and they are wonderful. Well, as always, thank you for your time. I appreciate you listening. I would love to hear from you in the comments what video games you are playing now, maybe some of the ones that have been the most inspirational for you over the course of your life. If you would like to join our Discord community, there's a link below. Thank you to patron Who, What, Where, When for your support, and if you would like to support the channel, you can check out the link below to our Patreon as well. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon. And maybe really soon, because we might be doing another podcast about video games. So let me know if you would like that in the comments below.